That's okay. We can recycle this piece of clay, and I'm going to show you how to today. Hi, this is the Neighborhood Potter, and I'm Liz Proffetty. And today we're going to be talking about how to recycle clay at various stages. Things from when you collapse a pot down on the wheel and you just have wet, gooey clay, or when you have dry pieces of trimmings or broken pots that you don't want to keep because they cracked or for other reasons. Clay doesn't have to get wasted at this stage. We can just keep reusing it, and I'm going to show you how to do that. That's the wet, sticky pot that I just lost on the wheel. So it's going to stay here on this piece of plaster for a little while, maybe is 20 minutes at that, we'll do it. And once it is sitting on this plaster, it's going to be getting the moisture absorbed out of it. The plaster is very absorbent for us, and it will take the clay and eventually it will suck that moisture out, and when we pick it back up we'll be able to wedge it back into usable clay. So if a pot gets lost on the wheel and it's wet and sticky, it's not going to waste. Here it is, just going to go back into a bag of clay in about 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and it'll be usable again. We also make scrap clay that's going to need to be recycled when we're trimming on the wheel or cleaning pots up. So these trimmings that just came off of that pot need to go in a bucket like this with other bits of clay that I will let sit in there until it's completely dry. Once they're dry, then I'm going to start the next process, and the bucket is full. I'm going to start the next process of recycling. This is a bucket full of dry clay. So it's all dry and crumbly. There's no moisture left to it, and I'm going to recycle this clay today. I actually have something to add to it today. Sadly, this lovely platter that I made developed some cracks on the back, so I need to recycle this as well. There's no sense putting it into the kiln where it's going to become a permanent fixture when it already has a crack on it. So I have to break this up, and you can see how easily clay in the dry stage will break. It just kind of shatters. I like to tell people it's dry mud, so you want to take care to not break it if you don't want to. These little bits here will just become part of the recycling. So I've broken up my platter, and now I'm going to add some water to this. I'm going to finish filling this bucket up with some water. I want to put in enough water that the clay is completely covered over. And now these pieces of clay are going to stay in this bucket for about a week's time till they completely dissolve and turn into sort of a slurry. And I'm going to show you what we do with that in just a moment. And one of my little suggestions is, as they're drying, I try not to disturb this bucket. It breaks down a lot easier if I just leave that water alone. This bucket of clay has been sitting around for about a week with water in it. And now I'm going to drain off the extra water out of the bucket. Before I start, I'll show you what the clay looks like now. So you can see that it's sort of broken down into little particles and pieces. It has a lot of air left in it at this moment. It's kind of fluffy is how I describe it. So I want to get the extra water off of there before I start to put this on the plaster to recycle, because otherwise the plaster would just have to absorb or evaporate all that extra water. So without disturbing it too much, I take a bowl. Usually this bucket is quite full, so I don't want to just lift it up. So I just take a bowl or something and I bail out the extra water off the top. Until I start to see mostly clay. A little bit of water is fine. I'll get the rest of that clay off, that water out of there. So there. So now you can see that the clay is in there. Now what I want to do is mix this clay up really well. Because I don't have any tools called a pug mill that would mix it up and de-air it and get all the lumps out on its own, I developed my own system where I use a drill with a paint stirring attachment. So I'm going to put it in there and I'm just going to mix it up, and it's going to get a lot creamier looking when I'm done. So it's kind of like a large pot of whipped cream or something like that. And this is why I said you wanted to step away. Okay. All right. So now I've splattered myself. It can be a little bit of a messy process, but here's the clay, and it's all sort of kind of broken up now. There's still small pieces of lumps in it, but much less, so that when I wedge it later, that should become a good usable clay. So I am going to take this bucket of clay, and I'm going to push it. I'm going to put it onto that plaster. I have to kind of push it over. Sometimes these buckets are quite full. This one was only half full, so it's not quite as heavy. I'm just going to use that same bowl, and I'm going to start to put it on here. And this piece of plaster that I made to hold this is big enough that if this was a full bucket of clay, I can do the entire bucket in one time. So it's kind of nice that way. And I just kind of spread it out over it. And so people have a love-hate relationship with this. Some people think that recycled gooey clay is wonderful, which I do, and some people think it's gross. I love it. I love the gooiness of it. So I'm just going to spread this out kind of even so that it dries evenly. I don't want to end up with thick and thin spots, so that I have pieces that might dry harder and softer. So I just kind of spread it out as evenly as I can and let that sit. So believe it or not, in about 24 hours, I'm going to be able to lift this piece of clay up, and I'm going to have usable clay all over again that's just the right consistency to use on the wheel or for hand building projects. This clay has been sitting on a piece of plaster for a day, although it started out like this. Now you can see that it's quite usable, and it no longer sticks to the plaster. It just wants to pop right back up. And it's quite soft, but malleable and not sticky. So now I can just wedge this piece of clay and reuse it back on the wheel, make hand building projects, or anything else I want to do with this piece of clay. In case you're wondering, recycled clay doesn't mean that it's not as good as clay that's fresh out of a bag from a factory. Recycled clay is actually more plastic, which means more flexible without breaking. And one of the ways you can check for flexible and plasticity in your clay is if you roll a little piece and you bend it and it doesn't develop a lot of cracks, then the clay is more plastic. So recycled clay actually becomes more plastic over time. So in some people believe that it makes for a better clay. Now, I also would like to share with you the different kinds of clay that we have here at Neighborhood Clay. There are different temperatures of clay as well as different kinds of clay. So here at Neighborhood Clay, we use a mid-range clay that's called that we call firing to cone 5 or 6. Cones are how we tell the temperature in clay, and without getting too confusing, I'm just going to say that we use this mid-range cone 5, 6 clays, but they do come in different makeups. This clay that I'm handling here is going to become a white stoneware. We usually refer to it as the gray clay around the studio so that we can tell the difference between that and this whiter clay, which is the porcelain clay that I like to use in my own personal work. We also carry a clay here that is, we kind of call the red clay, but it fires tan when it's all done, and I'm going to show you that in a moment. Each piece of clay, each kind of clay has its own good and bad qualities. This redder clay has a lot of grittiness to it when you're using it, which can feel kind of yucky on the wheel if you don't like that kind of gritty feeling, but it also helps to make a stronger pot because the grit that's in there makes the clay a little, it gives it a lot more strength. This clay here is a smooth clay, and it's very versatile, and it works great for both beginners and all sorts of people love this clay. And then lastly, the porcelain is a really challenging clay to work with. Some people describe the feeling of being like working with cream cheese. So if you know that sort of soft, sticky feeling of it, it can feel like that. It doesn't hold its shape very easily, so it takes a lot more skill to use it without it collapsing on you or developing cracks like that platter that I made earlier. So when this clay starts to dry, it's going to go through some different stages. First, it's going to turn sort of a gray color, and I happen to have a chunk of clay right here that it has turned into this sort of gray, crumbly color. And now this piece of clay is going to be one of those pieces that goes into the recycling bucket. When this clay is that dry and it was made into a pot, we would put it into the kiln. The first firing of the kiln is called a bisque firing. And the bisque firing is a lower temperature than its final firing, and it gets all of the extra air out of there, and it turns the clay into a state in which it no longer will recycle. I think I've shown this before where it kind of makes a little tinging noise. It's one of the ways you can tell, but it's also drastically changed from its original color and state. So this piece of pottery here has gone into the bisque, and this is this clay and how it's changed. This is this clay, the browner clay, and how it has changed into this kind of somewhat less attractive pinkish orange color. And then lastly, this clay, the porcelain, has turned into a little bit of a slightly whiter color than the gray clay. And here it is. Now, they all will change once again once we've put some glaze on them, or even if we didn't put any glaze on them, they're going to go back into a firing, and that firing is going to go all the way up to, we call it cone 5 or 6, so it depends on the temperature. Cones are how we measure the heat in a kiln, so we don't necessarily memorize the degrees. This clay here this is an example of some green glaze on that clay, and then you can see the color that the clay has changed. It's slightly more buff. It's a nice dense clay. It doesn't have a very high absorption rate, so it works really well for sculptural and functional work. It's great for anything like mugs or plates or anything. It works very well for that. And you can see that the color of the clay is visual under a transparent glaze like this green, but it shows the color fairly accurately. As opposed to, this is the same green on this clay, and you can see how drastically the clay color has changed. It's become this kind of tan color with little speckles in it, and it's really affected the color of that green glaze. It's very different looking on there. And you can even see some of the speckles through the glaze. So that's that one. And then lastly, this is my porcelain, and I didn't have a test tile with just the porcelain, but this is a bud vase that I made, and the lower half has that green glaze on it. On my clay, it's a little bit of a slightly more intense green, and but it shows it pretty accurately again, kind of like the way if you were to use a white sheet of paper as opposed to a tan piece of paper, it's going to show me more accurately the color underneath it. So if you were using watercolors or something, if you can imagine the pigments being more accurate on a whiter clay, which is one of the reasons why I use this clay, is that I like the bright colors that show up later. People sometimes ask me where my clay comes from. So my clay is made by a company in California called Laguna, and we buy it from Portland Pottery. So they either will ship to you or you can drive down and pick up clay from them. I usually just go down because it's a wonderful store and I love to go down and see all the things that they have there. So if you're wondering where it comes from, that's where I get it from. While at Neighborhood Clay, we use cone 5 clay bodies that I described as firing to a mid-range. There are other clay bodies out there that are described as low fire or high fire. The low fire is, for instance, can be the sort of really dark, rich sort of brick reds that you see. And if you live in Maine and you dig in your garden and you dig up some gray, goopy stuff that you feels a little different than just your usual dirt, that gray clay is going to turn into a clay that looks a lot like this if you were to put it into the kiln. And that's how our bricks throughout New England were made. This pot here, I feel I should share, is made by an artist named Justin Rothshank. He's not a Maine artist, but he made this mug and it was given to me as a gift with Mr. Rogers on it, and I'm quite fond of it. And so you can see this lovely, rich, dark red clay from his low fire clay. Low fire clays are described as firing to cone 04, roughly, which is in our world a low temperature, so around 1900 degrees. Also about the same temperature as some bisque pottery, I bisque my pottery at here. And this is an example of bisque ware that I've purchased to be painted at Neighborhood Clay. So if you ever wanted to come in and just do a little paint your own pottery, this piece is an example of that, and it's a piece of bisque ware. It's been fired to a fairly low temperature. It's still changed, it won't recycle, and it still makes a little bit of a tinging noise, but it's a little, I feel like it's a little thumpier than the slightly higher fire clay that I use usually. And here's an example of how it looks when it's fired. The thing that's nice about low fire clay that people like is that it gives us very accurate, clear, bright colors. So when people are looking for those brighter colors, low fire clay is the way to go. And if you wanted something to show your colors off without being interfered by the dark red, a lot of times people will put a white glaze or a white slip first and then put their colors on top. Some colors will burn out in higher temperatures, so these low fire clays offer you the ability to use oxides and different colorants that will stay more true all the way up to the end. Now, skipping past the mid-range that we've already discussed, over here I have an example of some high fire clay bodies and pots. This piece of pottery was made by an artist named Jennifer Allen, and she uses a porcelain clay body that fires all the way up to what we call cone 10. So cone 10 is our, cone 10, cone 11 sometimes, is our highest temperatures we go with clay, generally speaking, without them starting to melt or distort. So this is also made out of a porcelain, but it is is designed and engineered to go all the way up to a higher temperature and still hold its shape. Whereas the clay that I use, if I was to put it into a cone 10 firing, it would get kind of melted, it might warp or do other unpleasant things that I wasn't looking for. This is a cup that I made myself a while back, experimenting in a higher fire temperature. This cup was made in a gas kiln, and as opposed to electric kiln. And in making of this cup, there was actually some salt added to the atmosphere, but we'll have to talk about atmospheric fires later. This is also made in an atmospheric firing at a high temperature. I believe this pot probably went up all the way up to cone 11, and we used wood to fire this kiln. So it wasn't a gas kiln, it wasn't an electric kiln, it was only fired by wood, which is part of the result of the colorants that are on this. Again, that's called an atmospheric firing, and we'll have to talk about that another time. But that's our high fire clays and our low fire clays, as opposed to our mid-range that we use here. So while you know that clay can be wonderful and user-friendly and immediate, now you know also a little bit more about the technical parts we think about in using clay. And I hope that you found it enjoyable and informative, and I'll see you next time on The Neighborhood Potter.